There's a moment right before something becomes official where a situation could still go either way, before a diagnosis is written down, before a decision is made, before something uncertain gets turned into something defined. You're just being observed. And once people start to agree on what they're seeing, it becomes a lot harder to change. If you've listened to the show before, you know I'm less interested in the headline version of a story and more interested in the moment underneath it, the part where something could have gone differently, but didn't, because that's usually where the pattern is. And today's episode is one of those stories that, on the surface, feels very contained. It's often told as this almost cinematic one off stunt. A reporter pretends to be insane, gets herself committed, and exposes terrible conditions, and then leaves. End of story. But when you sit with it a little longer, it starts to feel less like a stunt and more like a test. Not of the asylum, of the system that decides who belongs there. And more specifically, how easy it is to be placed into a category and how hard it is to get back out of it once you are. Because what Nellie Bly was really testing wasn't just what happened inside Blackwell's Island. She was testing the moment before that, the threshold, the point where observation turns into judgment, and judgment turns into something official. And what she found is that threshold is not nearly as solid as we'd like to think. So today, we're going to walk through two case studies that are separated by almost a century, but ask the exact same question. First, we're going to follow Bly as she intentionally enters a system designed to identify and contain people who are not in control of their own reality. And then, nearly 100 years later, we're going to look at what happens when a psychologist tries to run that same experiment again, this time with multiple people across multiple institutions, under the assumption that things have improved. And what both of these stories reveal is something a little uncomfortable. It's not just that the systems can fail, it's that once a system decides what you are, it becomes very difficult for it to see you any other way. And that's where this starts to feel a little less like history and more like a pattern. So let's rewind and let's get into it. A woman sits in a boarding house in New York City. It's 1887. The room is quiet in a way that shared spaces get when people are trying to pretend they're not watching each other. She's been acting a little off. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make a scene, just enough to unsettle people. She says she's afraid to go to bed. She tells the other women something feels wrong. She doesn't sleep. She stares too long. She hesitates when people speak to her, like she's deciding if she trusts them or not. And at first, it probably feels like one of those situations where you think, is she okay? Not she's dangerous or she's insane, just something's not right. Then something subtle shifts, because once a few people start to feel that way, it becomes easier for everyone else to feel it too. Concerns turn into consensus, and consensus very quickly starts to look like certainty. By the next day, she's being talked about in a different tone. By that afternoon, someone suggests she needs help. And within a matter of days, she's standing in front of a judge. Doctors examine her, and strangers ask her questions designed less to understand her and more to confirm what they've already begun to suspect. And just like that, it's decided. She's declared insane. And here's the part that matters: she's not. The woman sitting in that boarding house is Nellie Bly, or at least that's the name she's writing under. Her real name is Elizabeth Cochran, and at this point she's a reporter working for the New York World. And what she's doing here is not a breakdown, it's an experiment. She wants to answer a question that, at the time, is floating around but not being fully directed or confronted. What actually happens inside these institutions we send people to when we decide something is wrong with them? Not what we say happens, not what doctors report, not what the administrators claim. What really happens? And more specifically, how hard would it be to get inside one? That's the part she starts with. Not the conditions or the treatment or the stories, just the door. Because if the system is working the way it's supposed to, that door should be difficult to get through. There should be safeguards, standards, a kind of friction that prevents someone from being misidentified. So she decides to try it, not by exposing it from the outside, but by stepping into it. What's interesting and honestly a little unsettling is how little it takes. She later writes about practicing in the mirror, not in an over the top theatrical way. She's not trying to look like what we might imagine insanity to look like. She's aiming for something quieter, a kind of vague instability, confusion, unease, something that can't be easily pinned down, but also can't be dismissed. She checks into a place called the Temporary Homes for Females, which, even just as a name, feels like it exists in that gray area between shelter and holding space. And then she begins. She tells the women there that she doesn't feel safe. She says that she's afraid to go to sleep. She lets her thoughts wander just enough in conversation to make people feel uncomfortable. She refuses to settle, and that's it. No violence or outbursts or dramatic scenes, just enough deviation from what's expected to create doubt. And what happens next is almost procedural. The women around her grow uneasy. The staff begins to pay attention, and the doctor's called. She's evaluated. And here's where things start to narrow. Because once someone is brought in to assess whether something is wrong, the question quietly shifts. It's no longer, is she okay? But it becomes, what is wrong with her? Those are two very different questions. One allows for the possibility that nothing is wrong. The other assumes there is something, that it just needs to be identified. She's taken before multiple doctors. One of them reportedly describes her as undoubtedly insane. Undoubtedly. It's such a confident word for a situation built on so little. And within days, she's committed to Blackwell's Island. Now, Blackwell's Island isn't hidden or secret. It's part of the system. It's funded, managed, and, at least on paper, designed to care for people. Which is part of what makes what she finds inside so difficult to reconcile. Because it doesn't look like care. It looks like containment. She describes long rows of women sitting on hard benches, not allowed to talk to each other. Hours of stillness. Not rest, just enforced inactivity. The kind that doesn't calm a person down so much as it empties them out. There's a moment she writes about that feels small when you first read it. It's not one of the headline details, not the baths or the violence or the obvious neglect. It's a meal. Which sounds almost insignificant until you sit with it a little longer. Because meals are supposed to be grounding and predictable, something that breaks up the day and gives you a sense of time moving forward. And inside Blackwell's Island, even that starts to come apart. The women are brought into a dining area and seated together, but not in a way that feels communal. There's no conversation or interaction, just rows of people eating because they're told to. Bly describes the food in a way that's less about taste and more about what it represents. She writes that the tea was, quote, so weak that it looked like dirty water, end quote. And the bread was stale and hard enough that it felt like something you had to force yourself through rather than eat. The broth, if you can even call it that, was thin, often spoiled, sometimes carrying a smell that made it difficult to bring close to your face. And what stands out isn't just that the food is bad, it's that there's no real alternative. No option to refuse it without consequence. No adjustment, no acknowledgement that this might not be enough. You eat it or you don't eat it. And either way, it doesn't really change anything. After the meal, the women are taken back to the benches, and this is where the day seems to stretch out in a way that doesn't quite make sense. They're made to sit upright, not lying down or resting or engaging, just sitting, hour after hour. No talking aloud, no reading, no activity to break the time. Bly writes, quote, we were compelled to sit on straight, narrow benches from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, end quote. 14 hours, which is a long time to do anything, but especially a long time to do nothing. And the way she describes it, it's not just physically uncomfortable, it's mentally disorienting. Because without movement or conversation, without any real change in environment, the day stops having shape. It becomes something you just exist inside of. And then there's moments that feel less like neglect and more like something else entirely. There are baths, but they're not what you would expect them to be. They're not restorative or calming, not even particularly clean. They're just procedural. The women are brought in one by one without much explanation, and the process moves rather quickly, too quickly for there to be any real sense of care in it. Bly describes being told to undress with little regard for privacy and then being placed into a tub filled with water that isn't just cold, it's shockingly cold. The kind of cold that hits your body all at once and takes your breath with it. Before she can fully react, a bucket of water is poured over her head. She writes, quote, I protested, but without avail. The water was icy cold, and I was shivering from the shock, end quote. More water follows. Her head is forced back. Her hair is handled roughly, quickly, less like someone washing another person and more like someone completing a task. She tries to speak, to object, to slow it down, and it doesn't change anything because at that point, what she's saying isn't really being processed as a request. It's being processed as part of the situation she's already been placed into. Another woman nearby cries out during her bath, and the response isn't concern, it's irritation. The kind that suggests the reaction itself is the problem, not what's causing it. And the whole thing is over almost as quickly as it starts. But not in a way that feels efficient. in a way that feels dismissive. Like the goal wasn't cleanliness, it was control. And again, what she's saying in that moment, her discomfort, her attempt to explain, doesn't really change anything because it's no longer being received as information. It's being filtered through what they've already decided she is. And at one point, she tries to engage with the women around her. She wanted to speak and connect and to understand who they are and why they're there. And what she starts to notice is that many of them just don't respond, not because they can't, but because they just don't. There's a kind of withdrawal that's settled in, a quietness that feels less like peace and more like absence. And she begins to question something that, up until that point, she hadn't fully considered. How many of these women were actually ill when they arrived? And how many of them became worse here? She later writes, quote, "What accepting torture would produce insanity quicker than this treatment," end quote. And it's not framed as exaggeration. It reads more like realization, something she arrives at slowly after sitting in it long enough to understand what it's doing. Because the conditions aren't just uncomfortable, they're cumulative. The cold baths, the poor food, the isolation, the lack of stimulation, the way every attempt to assert yourself is either ignored or reinterpreted. Individually, each of these things might be manageable, but together, over time, they start to wear something down. Not all at once, and not in a way that feels dramatic, but gradually and quietly, until the person who walked in begins to feel further away. And this is the part that's easy to overlook if you're focused on the more obvious details. It's not just that the environment is harsh, it's that it creates the very thing it claims to contain. At some point, Bly shifts her approach. She stops performing. She begins acting completely like her normal self. Calm, observant, rational. She answers questions clearly. She behaves exactly the way someone would behave if they were trying to demonstrate that they are not, in fact, insane. And nothing changes. What starts to become clear to her, and it's not immediate, it kind of builds slowly, is that the problem isn't just that she got in too easily. It's that when she's in, there's no real pathway for the system to correct itself. She can answer questions clearly. She can behave exactly as she would outside. She can do everything you would expect someone to do if they were trying to demonstrate that they're well. And it doesn't move anything, because at that point, she's no longer being evaluated from scratch. She's being interpreted. And those are two very different things. Now, this is the part of the story that tends to get summarized quickly, but it's actually the most important because what you would expect, what we all kind of assume, is that if the system made a mistake, correcting that mistake would just require new information, better behavior, clear communication, time. But that's not what happens. Instead, her behavior is reinterpreted. Her calmness becomes suspicious. Her clarity becomes strategic. Her normalcy becomes something to explain away rather than to accept. It's not that the system refuses to see her clearly, it's that it no longer knows how. Because once a label had been applied, everything starts to filter through that label. And removing that label would require admitting that it might have been wrong in the first place, which is a much heavier lift than just maintaining it. She later reflects on how the environment begins to affect her, gradually, not dramatically, but there's a kind of dulling that sets in. There was a loss of energy, a sense that resistance is pointless, and that this is coming from someone who knows the entire time that she has an exit. There are people on the outside aware of where she is and that this is temporary. Even with that knowledge, she feels it. So you start to wonder what happens to the people that don't have that, who don't have anyone advocating for them, who don't have a deadline, who don't have a version of themselves waiting on the other side. Because the conditions she's describing aren't just uncomfortable, they're completely disorienting. They strip away routine and agency and your identity eventually, and they replace it with something very simple. You are here because something is wrong with you, and everything around you reinforces that idea. Eventually, the newspaper intervenes. Lawyers get involved, strings are pulled, and she's released. Not because she successfully convinced the system she was sane, but because someone with authority outside the system said she could leave. That distinction matters a lot because it means the system didn't correct itself. It was overridden. And the women she leaves behind, the ones who were sitting on those benches going through those same routines, being interpreted through those same assumptions, they stay. No intervention, no reveal, no correction, just continuation. And this is where the story starts to shift from being about one person's experience to something a little broader. Because what Bly set out to test wasn't just the conditions inside the asylum, it was the threshold we were talking about earlier. The point at which a person crosses from being seen as normal to being seen as something else. And what she found is that threshold is surprisingly low, lower than we probably like to believe. And once you cross it, Getting back is not nearly as straightforward as it should be. Nonetheless, her reporting does lead to change. There's an investigation, funding increases, and the conditions inside Blackwell's Island are reviewed in a way that they hadn't been before. But what she exposed wasn't just the conditions, it was something way harder to fix. A system that could make a decision about a person and then struggle to ever see them outside of it. It's tempting to hear a story like this and place it firmly in the past, to think of it as something tied to a different time, a different standard of care, a different understanding of mental health. And to some extent, that is true. A lot has changed. But the core question she was asking, how easy is it for a system to decide what you are, and how hard is it to change that once it's been decided, that question doesn't really belong to one time period. It kind of lingers. And about a century later, someone decides to ask it again. But this time, it's a scientist. And this time, instead of one person trying to get inside, it's 8. Almost a century passes before someone decides to ask the same question again. This was not a stunt or something from a newsroom. This was something that on paper feels more controlled. It was structured and a little bit more objective. It was an experiment. And the assumption going into it, whether spoken out loud or not, is that things have evolved. That whatever ambiguity existed in the late 1800s had been refined, standardized, and studied. That the threshold Bly slipped through has at some point been reinforced. So in the early 1970s, a psychologist named David Rosenhan designs a study that is, in its simplicity, almost disarming. He gathers a small group of people, 8 in total, and they're not patients. They have no history of mental illness. They're functioning adults, like teachers and graduate students and a pediatrician. And he asks them to do something very specific. Go to different psychiatric hospitals across the United States, present themselves for evaluation, and claim that they hear a voice. Just one. No elaborate backstory, no spiraling behavior, no performance beyond that initial moment. The voice says things like, quote, empty, or hollow, or thud. Words that are vague enough to feel a little unsettling, but not so specific that they point clearly to anything. And once they're admitted, they stop. No more symptoms, no more performance. From that point forward, they behave exactly as they normally would. They speak clearly, they follow instructions, they engage with staff, they take notes, they observe, they wait to be seen as what they are. Which is to say, sane. Every single one of them is admitted. And at first, the process feels exactly the way you'd want it to. It was structured and careful and professional. They're asked questions about their lives and their histories and their relationships. There's a kind of thoroughness to it that feels reassuring, like this is a system that takes its role seriously. Each pseudo-patient explains what brought them in, that something felt off, that there was a moment where they couldn't quite account for, and then they move quickly past it because everything else about their lives is normal. Their work, their families, their routines, and the responses they get aren't dismissive, they're actually attentive. Notes are taken and details are recorded and clarifications are asked for, which at first feels like a good sign, until something shifts. Not dramatically, but just enough that it's noticeable. Because the information they're giving, the normal parts of their lives, doesn't seem to carry the same weight as the single symptom they reported. It's all being written down, but it's not being held equally. And once that happens, the interaction starts to feel less like an evaluation and more like a process unfolding in a direction that's already been set. They're still answering questions, but something was already settled. That part on its own is striking, but still explainable. Systems are designed to err on the side of caution. It makes sense in a way that a reported hallucination would be taken seriously. But what happens after admission is where the experiment begins to mirror something deeper. Because once they are inside and once they begin behaving normally, nothing changes. They tell the truth. They say they feel fine. They say the voices have stopped, and they ask to leave. And instead of that information reshaping their diagnosis, it just gets absorbed into it. Their behavior is documented but not interpreted on its own. It becomes part of the condition, a phase, a strategy, a temporary clarity that still fits within the assumption that something is wrong. And what you start to see is that the system isn't really set up to reassess in a way that we might expect. It's set up to just stabilize. or to maintain, to move forward with the initial conclusion, adjusting around it rather than undoing it. The pseudo-patients begin documenting everything they can. They take notes openly in front of staff. They're not hiding it or disguising it, just writing it down. They're writing down what they're observing, and at one point, it's recorded in their files as a symptom. It was recorded as, quote, writing behavior, which is such a simple phrase, but it changes everything because it takes something neutral, something completely ordinary, and turns it into like an evidence. And once that happens, it becomes really difficult for anything they do to exist outside of that framework. Their interactions with staff are limited, often impersonal. Questions go unanswered, and attempts at conversation are redirected or ignored. There's a kind of distance that settles in, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of routine, out of efficiency. A system moving at a pace that doesn't allow for prolonged engagement. There's one detail from the study that feels small on paper, but if you picture it, it's kind of hard to unsee. The pseudo-patients would approach staff, doctors, nurses, attendants, and try to start a conversation. Not anything complicated, just basic questions like, when will I be discharged? What should I be doing today? Can you help me understand what's happening? And what they encountered wasn't hostility. It wasn't even outright dismissal. It was something much quieter than that. They were just ignored. Not every time, not on every interaction, but often enough that it became a pattern. Staff would just walk past them or respond briefly without stopping, or answer in a way that closed the interaction before it really began. And Rosenhan later quantified it. In one part of the study, when a pseudo-patient attempted to engage a staff member, the interaction lasted on average less than a minute, sometimes just seconds, which doesn't sound like much until you imagine yourself in the position, trying to be understood, trying to get clarity, and slowly realizing that you're not really being engaged with as someone who needs answers. You're just being processed. And within that, something else starts to stand out. In several cases, it's the other patients, the ones who are actually admitted, who begin to question what's happening, who pull them aside and say, in effect, you don't belong here. You're not like the others. There's a clarity in those moments that cut through everything else. The people who are supposedly the least reliable observers in the system are the ones most accurately identifying the reality, and the people tasked with diagnosing it are the ones missing it entirely. Eventually, the pseudo-patients are released, but not in a way that you might expect. They're not discharged as healthy. They're discharged with diagnosis like schizophrenia in remission, which carries a very different implication. It suggests that the illness was real, that it just had simply quieted, temporarily. The label doesn't disappear, it just softens, but it does stay attached. And that matters because it reflects something subtle but important. The system doesn't reverse itself. It adapts its language just enough to move forward without having to fully acknowledge that the original conclusion may have been incorrect. When Rosenhan publishes the study, the reaction is immediate and intense. Hospitals push back, and psychiatrists question the methodology. There's discomfort and defensiveness and debate, not just about the findings, but about what those findings suggest. Because if the system cannot reliably distinguish between those who are experiencing mental illness and those who are not, then what exactly is it measuring? And how much of it is shaped by expectation? At one point, a hospital challenges Rosenhan directly. They say, essentially, if this is true, then send your fake patients to us. We'll catch them. We know what to look for. And Rosenhan agrees. And over the next several weeks, the hospital evaluates incoming patients with that challenge in mind, looking carefully, scrutinizing behavior, trying to identify who might be pretending. They flag dozens, people they believe are part of the experiment, people they believe aren't truly ill, and at the end of the period, they report their findings. They were confident and certain, and Rosenhan tells them he didn't send anyone. That moment tends to land as a kind of twist, but it's not really that. It's a continuation, because what it reveals is not just that the system can misidentify sanity as illness, it's that once the possibility of error is introduced, it can also swing the other way, seeing performance where there is none, questioning reality where it actually exists, trying to correct for a flaw without fully understanding it. And when you place that next to what Bly experienced, almost a century earlier, the parallel becomes difficult to ignore. Different time period, different structure, different language, but the underlying pattern feels familiar. And it raises a question that neither of these experiments fully answers, but both of them circle around. If a system is designed to categorize people, at what point does it stop observing them and start confirming what it actually believes to be true? There's something both of these stories do that's easy to miss if you're focused on what happened to the people inside them. They don't just show you that a system can make a mistake, they show you how a system holds on to that mistake. Because the unsettling part of both Bly's experience and Rosenhan's experiment isn't the moment of entry, it's everything that happens after. It's the fact that once a conclusion is reached, once a label is applied, everything that follows begins to organize itself around that decision. When Bly was first evaluated, there was still a kind of openness to the situation. People were observing her and trying to make sense of what they were seeing. There was room, however, small, for ambiguity. But once the word insane entered the conversation, and especially once it was written down, formalized and documented, that ambiguity started to close, and everything that came after had to exist in relation to that word. Her behavior didn't change, but the interpretation of it did. And that shift is subtle enough that it can feel almost invisible while it's happening. Because from the inside of the system, it doesn't feel like reinterpretation, it feels like consistency. The same thing happens in Rosenhan's study, just with different language. A person reporting hearing a voice, and that information is taken seriously and evaluated and used to form a diagnosis. And once that diagnosis exists, it becomes the anchor point. Everything else gets pulled toward it. So when the pseudo-patients behave normally, that normal behavior doesn't float freely. It doesn't exist on its own. It's just reframed. And this is where the pattern starts to feel less like flaw and more like function. Because if you step back from both of these stories, what you're really looking at is not a system that is trying and failing to find the truth. You're looking at a system that's trying to maintain a version of reality that it can operate within. Something stable and predictable. Something that allows decisions to be made and actions to be taken without constantly reopening the question of whether those decisions were correct in the first place. Because reopening that question, especially in a system that deals with people's identities and diagnoses and safety, it's not simple. It's disruptive and it introduces uncertainty. So instead, what happens is something quieter. Once a decision is made, the system begins to move forward as if that decision is just plain true. Not because it has been definitively proven, but because it has been accepted. And acceptance over time starts to look a lot like truth. And you can see this dynamic show up in other places too, not always in the exact form, but with the same underlying structure. In the early 1970s, around the same time Rosenhan was running his study, another experiment was taking place at Stanford. Led by Philip Zimbardo, it set out to explore how people behave when placed into roles within a controlled environment. Participants were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison. And what unfolded is often described in terms of how quickly people, quote, became these roles. But if you look at it through the lens of what Bly and Rosenhan were observing, something slightly different comes into focus. The system didn't just reveal behavior, it shaped it. It created conditions where certain behaviors made sense, where they felt appropriate, where they were reinforced by the structure itself. And once those roles were established, stepping outside of them became increasingly difficult. Not because the participants couldn't, but because the environment was constantly pulling them back into that place. A few decades earlier, Upton Sinclair took a different approach. He entered the meatpacking industry, not as an observer, but as a participant. He worked inside the system and documented what he saw, and then published it with the intention of exposing the conditions workers were enduring. And he didn't expose them. But what's interesting is what happens next. The public reaction didn't center on the workers, it centered on the food, on contamination, safety, consumption. The same information moved through a different lens, and in doing so, it produced a different outcome. Which is another way of saying, even when you manage to show people something clearly, what they see is still shaped by the framework they've already operated within. You see a version of this again in the work of John Howard Griffin. He temporarily altered his appearance and traveled through the American South in the late 1950s to experience segregation firsthand. And what he documented was not just the existence of discrimination, that was already known, but the texture of it, the daily interactions, the accumulation of small moments that, taken together, define the experience. But even in that case, there's a boundary that never fully disappears. He can enter the system, and he can observe it. He can be treated according to its rules, but he can also leave. And that ability to exit changes the nature of the experience, even if it doesn't invalidate it. It creates a separation between those who are passing through a system and those who are held within it. And that distinction brings you back again to Bly, because what made her investigation possible was not just her willingness to enter the asylum. It was her certainty that she would not have to stay, that there was a version of herself outside of it that still existed, that someone somewhere would come to retrieve her. The women she met didn't have that. And Rosenhan's pseudo-patients, while operating under controlled conditions, didn't either, not in the same immediate guaranteed way. They entered with a plan, but once they were inside, the process of leaving was no longer entirely in their control. It depended on how the system chose to interpret them. So the question that both of these stories leave you with isn't necessarily whether those specific systems have improved. In many ways, they have. Practices have changed, standards have evolved, oversight has increased. But the deeper question, the one that lingers a little longer, is simpler than that. Once something or someone has been defined by a system, how much of what comes after is actually observation, and how much of it is just confirmation? If the difference between those two things is harder to see than we'd like to admit, then it's worth asking where else the pattern might be playing out. Not in the exact same form, but in quieter, less visible ways. Places where the label comes first, and everything else follows. There's a version of the story that ends cleanly, where Nellie Bly goes in and exposes what's happening, writes about it, and things improve. Where Rosenhan runs his experiment and the field reacts and the flaws get corrected. Where the system learns. And in some ways, that's true. But that's not really where the stories land, because neither of them are just about a specific institution at a specific moment in time. Once Bly was labeled, she wasn't just a person being observed anymore. She was a case, something to be interpreted, managed, and explained. And once Rosenhan's pseudopatients were diagnosed, they weren't just individuals moving through a hospital. They were examples of something already understood, even when they weren't. And what both of these stories show, in different ways, is that systems don't always struggle because they can't make decisions. Sometimes they struggle because they make them, and then they don't know how to revisit them. It's easier to move forward than to go back. Easier to adjust the explanation than undo the conclusion. Easier to interpret new information in a way that fits than to let it challenge what's already been decided. And most of the time, that doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel like a failure. It just feels like things working the way they're supposed to, until you're the one being interpreted. Until you're the one trying to explain yourself in a system that already thinks it understands you. Until you realize that the difference between being observed and being defined is sometimes smaller than you thought. And maybe that's the part that lingers. Not whether these specific systems have changed, but how often we assume that the ones we rely on now are better at seeing clearly, better than the ones that came before them. Because if there's one thing these stories seem to agree on, it's that once something has been decided, it takes more than just the truth to undo it. Thanks for listening to This Again. If this episode got you thinking, send it to someone who tends to question things a little bit deeper, or someone who probably should. I'll see you next time.